Tuesday, November 13th. Welcome to the Matt Sager Podcast. I am, of course, your host, Matt Sager, and I've got some news that may shock and appall you. Or it may make you shrug and go, yeah, no doy. But regarding WFAN sportscaster Mike Francesa, turns out he is a rather despicable, heartless man. I know, I was shocked too. I mean, FAN is all about doing the right thing. It's all about being for the people, by the people. It is a wonderful, wonderful home of true sports talk, whatever the hell that ever meant. Like, you can do talk, you can do sports, but when you really make an effort to do this sort of portmanteau of, no, I'm not just doing sports, I'm talking about them. That's how you end up with an idiot like Mike Francesa on the air, who is so dull that he's most famous, as far as I know, for the many, many videos of him when he was simulcast on, I believe it was the Yes Network or one of these sports cable channels. But there's video of him all over YouTube. Just start typing in Mike Francesa in YouTube, and it'll autocomplete sleeping on the air. So prior to today, that was what he was most known for, being the guy who literally put himself to sleep. He had this sort of Ray Romano-ish. I actually think of him more, this is more of a radio in-joke than anything else, but long before I ever heard of Ray Romano, I had a chief engineer I worked with at K-Rock named Richie Herbie, who I actually turned into a character for some bits I would write and produce for the Stern Show. And he'd go, oh, you sound kind of like Richie Herbie. And I'd be all humble and like, yeah, that was kind of my inspiration. Thanks for noticing.
And he sort of talked like this, if you're going to be in engineering, you got to change the pattern of Z-Rock, which is our sister station.
And imagine if that guy had a show in which, with this very seemingly limited range of interests, I don't know about his knowledge. I'm guessing that to be working at FAN, he knows sports fairly well, but everything I've heard and seen of him, he's not one of these guys who's like, oh yeah, back in 1922, they had this league and this guy set this record. He just goes,
yeah, well, Mets are doing good, and Giants are doing great. I need a Diet Coke.
He's just an insufferable douche. That is not actually news. I've been aware of this for some time. And there was some deal where he left FAN. The way he portrayed it, this was like a year ago. The way he portrayed it was that he was moving on to bigger and better things and he just had his fill because he was so frighteningly talented. And then a few other things happened at FAN and he found himself requesting his job back. What's more surprising is that he got it. Now, FAN, this is difficult for me to talk about. The company now called Entercom was at one time Infinity Broadcasting, CBS Radio, Westinghouse, all of these radio broadcasting companies at which I once worked. And at my very first internship at K-Rock, the program director whom I worked under is now the program director of WFAN, a really nice guy who I remember very fondly named Mark Chernoff. And his station's woes do not, at least to my way of thinking, reflect on him as a person or as a program director. Other than that, I'm sure he's very concerned. Because the other thing that happened during all this Francesa, I want to call it drama, but can you really say that about a man who is mostly known for falling asleep during his own shows? Like, don't you have to be a little bit engaged in drama, like awake for it? But so amidst the Francesa business, shall we say, WFAN, or the Fan as it's affectionately referred to by its listeners and staff, had another very popular and very successful show on the air. The morning show called Boomer and Carton. The Boomer in question was football great Boomer Esiason, and the Carton was a guy named Craig Carton, who one day last year, Boomer showed up to do the show and did a sort of intro saying, hey, it's me, Boomer. I'm sure Craig's going to be here any second, so for now, I'm just going to vamp and fill some airtime. How's everybody doing? Let's go to the phones. Oh, wait, there's someone at the door. They've got jackets on that look very official. We're going to break. Comes back from the break and goes, so apparently my on-air partner was raided by the FBI today and may or may not ever be seen or heard from again on this station or anywhere outside of a prison cell. So let's talk about those Giants, huh? And Carton has been found guilty. He was running a Ponzi scheme where he was selling tickets to pay for his gambling debts. The actual existence of these tickets, like he may have been selling, aside from scalping, which is not a good thing to be doing, and aside from buying in bulk and preventing others from buying tickets, that is, of course, something that is very bad and that exists in a legal gray area where, depending on the scope and extent to which you've done it, depending on whether or not you have approval from parties A, B, or C, is most often some form of illegal. But when you're selling tickets and you don't actually have the tickets to provide, That is fraud, and that is what he was found guilty of. It wasn't long ago either. It was November 7th. Hasn't even been a week. He was found guilty of all charges, which include securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud. He's looking at easily 45 years in the slammer, which means for him, really. I'm not saying he's old. He's not, but he's middle-aged. That means getting out of prison for him. I believe he's about my age, so he'd get out of prison at 90. And that's, look, I don't celebrate anyone's misfortunes, and I don't know Craig Carton at all. And I I've got a lot of friends working at FAN. Most of my friends who I stay in touch with in radio are either at FAN or at this sort of nebulous Entercom building where they do stuff for all kinds of stations, one of the main ones of which is FAN, and the rest of them work at Sirius XM. Those are really the radio people I'm in touch with. Oh, and in Woodstock, there's some really good folks I know working at WDST, and I guess I like the local Fordham. Yeah, you know what? I've got a lot of radio friends. I'm sorry. But the point is, I take no pleasure in shitting on WFAN, but I need to take Mike Francesa out to the woodshed, because he's an asshole. He makes this abundantly clear in every phone call he takes, in every comment he makes, in the way his shows are only about his interests, as if the audience doesn't matter. Pleasing the customer should really matter to you if you're a broadcaster. It clearly doesn't matter to Mike Francesa. And he really drove that point home today when a caller asked him about Stan Lee and how Mike Francesa felt about Stan's passing. As if you heard me last night, I've never really gotten that close to breaking down on the air before, and I hope not to again. But pretty much the polar opposite of that is this phone call that Mike Francesa received regarding the death of Stan Lee and how Mike Francesa felt about it all. And he's Francesa, all right. He is true to himself, however disgusting that self may be.
Eddie in Hoboken. What's up, Eddie?
Hey, what's up, Mike?
What's happening?
Hey, Mike, Stan Lee died today. Did you ever meet the guy? What do you think of him?
Stan Lee.
Yeah, Stan Lee.
I don't
Never
know who
heard
he
of Stan
is.
Lee?
Don't know who he is, no.
Jesus.
Who is he? Who is he? Who is Stan Lee?
He was one of the creators of Marvel Comics.
Oh, who cares? I mean, I'm sorry, I'm not a comic book guy. Is that who he is, Stan Lee? The guy
He created Spider-Man. That was his big thing.
created Spider-Man? Sorry. I never was a comic book reader as a kid. I apologize.
So
Never.
the thing about that's really upsetting, and that he's trying to defend himself with on Twitter, saying, oh, what? I was just saying, he's finding it very difficult, but he's trying to explain that when he said,
Who cares?
that what he meant was, who cares about comics? Which is a pretty weak excuse, and listening to the audio, it sounds like he says, I've listened to it like 10 times today because I did not want to shit on Mike Francesa without cause. I didn't want to seem as though I was so easily provoked that I didn't think it through, consider the angles. But I even tweeted back and forth with Mike today, and he said,
Just to be clear, I just don't know what comics are.
he even tweets in that voice. And I wrote back, you know what, Mike? Reading comics requires you to stay awake for long periods of time, just like broadcasting. So I can see why you would never have been attracted to it or just about any other pursuit. Nothing as mature and serious and universally interesting to all genders and ages and interest groups as the tallying of sports stats. No, comics are just childish, simple-minded pursuits. So, the truth is, it's not terribly offensive as a human being to shit on comics. It does speak to someone's ignorance. I can't tell you how many times. I mean, I remember seeing Blue is the Warmest Color with a group of people a couple years ago. And me saying, yeah, it was very, very true to the comic. And everyone looked at me like I just said something shocking. They were like, comic? The source material for that was a comic? I'm like, yeah, I hate to break it to you, but in many countries, comics are considered literature, not just superhero comics. And in fact, most of the ones that have garnered so much praise have not been superhero comics. But yes, sequential storytelling told with art and words is extremely popular across the world, tremendously influential, an enormous part of the culture that was in most countries never stigmatized the way it was here in America, which in fact is largely due not to the juvenile trappings of some of the Big Two's offerings, which by the way, pick up a copy of any comic put out by the Big Two that's currently on the stands, and whatever else you can say about it, a lot of these topics are no longer juvenile. These publishers get that many of their customers are kids, but even more of them are people who were kids once kids and have grown up with the books. So Batman is often bought by 30, 40, 50, 60-year-olds, not for their kids or grandkids, but for themselves. So yes, comics are legitimate, and yes, people care. But Stan Lee was also a human being, one who I expounded on in great detail on last night's episode 57 of the Matt Sager podcast. And if you want to hear what I've got to say about Stan, and if you want to have a little bit of fun at my expense, because I was really and am very broken up about his passing and about the way his last couple of years were spent, it's a very sad story. The only response that is not acceptable when you hear somebody died: oh, who cares? I'm going to make a confession. I tend to be very, very honest on this podcast, and this will be no exception. I know nothing about sports. I just have never gotten interested in them. I'll play them. But if it's not baseball or like lacrosse or something really, really basic, like if it's football, you need to sit me down for several days and explain to me what a quarterback does, what a running back does. Is a kicker really just somebody who kicks and then just stands there? I don't know. It's one of the reasons why Thanksgiving is an unpleasant day for me. Like, I love meeting with the family. I don't like eating dinner at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And then football, as if the tryptophan wasn't enough. I start hearing all these, oh, he's on the 70-yard dash. He's doing the quarter mile here. Wow, look at the way he headbutted that guy. It's like, oh, God, how is anyone interested in any of this? But if you said to me, if you were to call the Matt Sager podcast and go, Matt, the second baseman for the Red Sox died, I'd go, oh, that's terrible. I don't know who the fuck he is. I don't care. I care that a human being, a human life, has been lost. And Francesa really betrayed something quite despicable about himself in that answer. He can dress it up any way he wants. He can defend himself on Twitter all day long. But as far as I'm concerned, he's a piece of shit. He is no more moral or ethical than Craig Carton, however more law-abiding he may or may not be. He takes no pride in his work. He falls asleep on TV and then gets mad when you talk to him about it. So WFAN, as far as its on-air personalities go, its more high-profile ones, is seemingly a wretched hive of scum and villainy. And this is difficult for me to say because, as I said, I like Chernoff an awful lot. There's all these producers and production coordinators and production directors over there who are good friends of mine. Please don't stop listening to FAN. But I would encourage anyone with the power to do so, to nudge Francesa's sleepy ass out the door. He's given you an excuse now by being this awful. And I can't imagine he's bringing anything to the table. I mean, first off, he is not in his blooming youth. And he is not capable of maintaining a state of wakefulness. So my suspicion is he could be replaced quite handily. The other thing I wanted to touch on briefly tonight, while Stan is still very much on my mind and in my heart, I just wanted to play a couple of sound bites from this New York Times interview. They posted it yesterday. They'd recorded it sometime not long before he passed. And just two things that I thought really summarized, first of all, what made him and what he brought to comics and what he made of Marvel so special and how he did it. He talks about creating characters. And this is why, as a kid, growing up in the 70s and reading comics from both that era and back issues from the 60s, why I loved The Flash, I loved Superman, I certainly loved Batman, but I felt like I knew Spider-Man, like I might know someone a lot like Daredevil. Stan sums it up so succinctly, so beautifully, and never once. I spoke last night of his humility and humbleness, and it is present in every word he says throughout this entire video, including this clip.
What I tried to do was take these characters who are obviously bigger than life and fictitious and make them seem real. They've got these powers, they do wonderful things, but what are the things that worry them? What are the things that frustrate them? I tried to write a well-rounded character with every character I did, rather than just somebody who is extra strong and can beat up the bad guys. If you're writing about people, you have to make the people come to life.
See, that's just it. It's the kind of stuff, as an actor, this gets drilled into your head. And frankly, you need to have this innate quality anyway. To really communicate, you want to be open-minded, of open heart, and you want to embrace humanity. Even when you're telling stories of green monsters and purple pants, there's a human in there. A complicated person with all kinds of problems, external and internal, and that was what separated Marvel from DC for a very long time. DC, of course, has, as have almost all comics publishers, including the indies, come to embrace that ethos. And Tom King, who I mentioned yesterday, is writing this excellent Mr. Miracle miniseries that's almost at an end. that features a Jack Kirby-created character. Well, of course, Mr. Miracle and Big Barda and all the new gods were all created by Jack Kirby. But in particular, the character I was referring to that appears in this series is this guy named Funky Flashman, who is, depending on how you look at it and depending on what was on Kirby's mind at the time, either a dig at Stan or an homage to him. But Tom King revealed something today that I only just now noticed. It's clearly part of the whole way he tells a story, and so I have been absorbing it. But I just didn't notice the detail. That just as, I mentioned yesterday that it was hard for me to accept that Stan was any kind of creative thief, as some of his partners would occasionally accuse him of, because he spoke to the audience so directly. He would open with, "Hey, Smilin' Stan here, and Marvelous Marie Severin's doing my colors, and Joltin' Joe Sinnot's on inks, and Rascally Roy Thomas is doing Thor starting next month." Like, he was so personal. And one of those many personal touches was that every Marvel Comics splash page, where you have your credits, would open with Stan Lee Presents New Mutants number 37, written by Chris Claremont, art by Bill Sienkiewicz, lettered by Tom Orzechowski. Stuff like that. Stan Lee Presents was your intro to every Marvel comic. And in every DC comic that Tom King has been doing, after the first few pages, because nowadays splash pages are about 4 or 5 pages into most books. But for instance, if you pick up the latest issue of Batman, which he's been writing, you'll see on the credits page, DC Comics Presents. And he pointed out that he's been doing that for years as a specific homage to Stan. He shared a really beautiful story today in which he said that he actually told Stan he was doing that. And Stan's reply was, "Oh, screw that. Forget about me. If you want to pay tribute to me, come write at Marvel," which he did at one point. I think I've mentioned his Vision miniseries was one of the most spectacular reads I've ever seen. And I'm somebody who has been reading comics since 1973. So the other thing I wanted to play from this New York Times Stan Lee clip, that just is going to be hard to hear, but I think is also very important and very beautiful and says a lot about him, and is important for us to hear in the wake of his passing. And this is on the subject of how Stan would like to be remembered.
What would you like people to be left with from your career?
He wrote some good stories. I don't think about that much. When I'm gone, I really don't care. It doesn't do you any good when you're gone.
Oh, that's a rough one. But as far as writing good stories, Stan, I can say with absolute certainty that wish has come true. You will forever be remembered, among many other things, as someone who wrote some damn good stories, created a universe, built an industry, survived a Senate subcommittee and a pop culture psychologist's war on you, your industry, accomplished so much. Anytime you see a Marvel character anywhere, understand that this couldn't have ever been possible without Stan Lee. And in 8 out of 10 cases, that character was created by Stan Lee, or is a new character based on a character created by Stan Lee, like Young Hulk, Spider-Man from the Ultimate Universe. Stan is so deeply embedded in pop culture, he will live forever. And that's how I choose to think of him. As immortal, hanging out in Asgard with his wife Joan, and Thor, and all the characters he created. So, I'm getting all sappy again. Time for me to stop. More podcasts will come tomorrow. In the meantime, email me if you'd like to get in touch. Matt@mattsager.com. You can also call 646-535-4788 and leave me a voicemail. Hit me up on Twitter @Matt Sager, on Instagram Real Matt Sager, and on Facebook The Matt Sager. I've also got a voiceover page there, which is Matt Sager VO, and my podcast page is Matt Sager Podcast. Also, check out the links in this podcast description. I've got a Patreon page, and I've got merch. I'd love you to check out both, and also offer me suggestions. I'd love to grow both more. I've got some awards, I've got some merch. I think they're both great, and I'd love for you to buy in, but I'd equally appreciate you saying, "Hey, that coffee mug's great, but what about shot glasses?" So, check them both out. And for my voiceover reels, contact information, more social media profiles, back episodes of this podcast, articles, blog posts, and much more, you can check out my website, mattsagervoiceover.com.